Hi, I'm Deanna Springer with another fun Stitch It Sisters quilting technique with classic time-saving tips by my longtime friend Nancy Zieman. First, let's look at the quilting technique we're featuring today. We'll be exploring straight line machine quilting with the ultimate quilt and stitch presser foot and the many different stitching options for machine quilting wall hangings and quilts. We'll be using Riley Blake shades, Pelham fleece, Schmetz quilting needles, Schmetz non-stick sewing machine needles, and Clover's Ultimate Quilt and Stitch presser foot. Master straight line machine quilting on a domestic sewing machine with the Ultimate Quilt and Stitch presser foot. This presser foot has a built-in stitch alignment ruler for guiding rows of parallel stitching. It's ideal for parallel line, straight stitching, top stitching, and straight line machine quilting. Achieve parallel line, straight stitching with the adjustable guide that locks into place. The large polyester presser foot glides smoothly over the fabric surface, and the front of the presser foot has a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The modern floating triangles quilt was made with parallel line rows of stitching for the machine quilting process. After piecing the top and layering the backing and the batting, that's when you go to the machine and you do your straight line machine quilting. This quilt was machine quilted with no marked lines. I simply followed the seams in the columns and adjusted the Ultimate Quilt and Stitch presser foot for each row of stitching. I began in the center of the quilt and I worked down. And then I turned and I came back up. And each time I did that, I worked from the center out, and I did change the thread with every stitching line. I used some neon threads to really pop this modern design. And you can see with just many rows of different widths of straight line machine quilting, you can have a really fun effect with just simple straight stitching. The next quilt is actually machine quilted with straight line quilting. This quilt was quilted by our long arm quilter, but when it came back, we were really impressed with how her design turned out. She'd used straight line machine quilting, which we know we can do that at home on our domestic sewing machine. She did do some fussy machine quilting stylized within each triangle, but I wanted to show this quilt because it's simple straight line stitching. This was done with simple straight lines, and each column, the stitching goes in a different direction. So you can see the straight line vertical rows are complemented by every other row in horizontal stitching. The next quilt is a wow factor quilt because it's actually a little table runner. You could use it as a wall hanging too. I really like table runner and wall hangings because they're versatile. You can use them on the wall or on the table. And there is machine quilting on this. When I finished this quilt, I was under deadline. So I minimized the machine quilting. And you can see the machine quilting is running parallel to the seam. And you'll only see machine quilting on this quilt through the center of each block. And that's it. I just minimized it, and it still has a wow technique or wow factor with minimal rows of parallel line stitching. Our next table runner has machine quilting on it, but it's nearly invisible because it was straight line machine stitched in the seam. So in the well of the seam are basically invisible stitches because they sink into the seam. And we did not need to use the guide arm for this quilt, but it acts as a third hand. You can have your guide out helping you control the fabric as it goes under your sewing machine and just stitch within the seam. This is a great technique for beginners because you don't have to worry about being straight, just stitch in the well of the seams for your machine quilting. The next quilt was machine quilted with no marked lines. What we did was echo quilt. So we set the presser foot up and stitched on each Dresden wedge within the wedge. We call it echo quilting or echo stitching. Just follow the edge of the fabric pieces and then do some straight line machine quilting in the vertical columns. The squares were also echo quilted. So a combination of echo quilting and straight line machine quilting for this wall hanging. The next quilt is a mod mini quilt I made for the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. It's a quilt challenge that quilts have to be 24 inches or smaller. And I mixed it up. I did echo quilting again with monofilament thread. So most of the half hexes are machine quilted 1/4 of an inch on the inside of the hexagons, but then I used a Sashiko sewing machine and cotton thread to stitch just a few. I changed the thread colors. There's blue thread to match the blue hexie and some pink and red to match that. So mixing up your thread options using monofilament thread, cotton quilting thread will give you a nice machine quilted technique too. Our next quilt demonstrates straight line machine quilting, and it was a test. When I received this prototype from Clover, I wanted a test to see if I start in the middle of my quilt and work outward, adjusting the guide with each straight line stitching, how far I could go. And I actually did this whole quilt before I ran out of 3-inch width on the guide. For my one marked line on this quilt, I used the 5-in-1 sliding gauge circle capability. So this is a circle maker and a 5-in-1 sliding gauge. I placed the pivot point at the intersection where these 4 fabrics meet, actually 3 fabrics meet here. I placed the 5-in-1 sliding gauge here, and I set the circle measurement here, and I marked one curve. I marked this one curved line just in the center of that block, and then I used a rotary cutting ruler and I extended those lines, the straight line straight down and straight to the edge. And I used the Ultimate Quilt and Stitch presser foot to stitch that curved line. So I began in the middle of the quilt and I stitched the single blue line of stitching. When I got to the bottom, I turned the foot and I used the 1/4 inch capability on the foot to mirror image that stitching line. I did the same thing, starting from this side and back down. And then I advanced the guide. Each row of stitching, I changed the thread quite often, and I did use metallic thread. And I changed the setting 1/8 of an inch with every line. So you see that radiating pattern from simply changing the width of your parallel line stitching. So this quilt was made with one marked line. The next quilt was also made with one marked line. This is a quilt that I made for the Sun Prairie Quilt Show. They had a challenge, and it was called the Nancy Zieman Challenge. So it was make a quilt to honor Nancy Zieman, and we all had to use the same 2 fabrics. And they're hidden in my quilt. Everyone had to use this green fabric and this green print fabric. And then you could choose any design you want up to 24 inches. So I chose Nancy's tumbler column quilt design, and I used Nancy's batik scraps to make this column quilt. So I call it Nancy's Stash, and I used metallic threads again to complement the beautiful batiks. And I marked one straight line near the center of the quilt. And this is arrow. You don't have to go just straight from edge to edge. I made an arrow, a forward moving arrow, and then I just echo quilted it. Parallel line rows using the 1/4 inch presser foot width to machine quilt. And at 1/3 place, I think the wow factor of the simplicity, the fabric speaks for itself, but once you machine quilt it, it really pops. And it sort of has a radiating sparkle using those metallic threads. The next quilt is another challenge quilt I make. I like making challenge quilts because they're small and it's a technique that I probably wouldn't have done if it weren't for the quilt challenge. So this was made for the Bob Ross challenge. And it's big, just big pieces of fabrics appliqued down. And it is straight line machine quilted, but the lines are not straight. So you can sew curves inward and outward with the Ultimate Quilt and Stitch presser foot. And I looked at the quilt design when it came time to quilt, and it just spoke to me of what to do. You can see I enjoy echo quilting and parallel line rows of stitching. It really gives the quilt a quilted look. but I started in the center. And what I did, I used the guide arm just as an extra third hand, and I stitched alongside the blue. I came up from the bottom and I stitched from the bottom up. And then I just worked inward, doing parallel lines of stitching next to each other. So you get that triangle kind of quilted look, and just from using the fabric piece, the cut applique piece, you get the design. And then I moved outward. The dark green was quilted in the same way as the blue, but when it came to the lighter green, I had to work around the Bob Ross applique. So I did use the outside of the quilt as a guide, outside of the piece, outside of the fabric piece, to guide my stitching rows. But then I stopped and I locked my stitches each time I came to the center applique, and then stepped ahead and then continued stitching. Remember though to backstitch each time you start and stop stitching in the middle of the quilt around the design. And then we have some fun curved stitching here around the applique. And again, just echo quilting. Moving the foot over 1/4 of an inch with each stitch. Before you do your straight line machine quilting, you need to get your quilt sandwich ready. So we have a quilt top, we have Pellon fleece batting, and we have some backing fabric. And what I like to do is I like to tape that backing fabric to the table. So using painter's tape, you'll tape your quilt backing to your work surface table. And your table won't be slanted. But you'll tape with painter's tape all the way around and keep that quilt back smooth and taut. The next layer will be batting. And I really like to use Pellon fleece for straight line machine quilting. It's a polyester batting that doesn't beard through to the front of the quilt while you're doing all your machine quilting. The next step is to choose how you'd like to machine quilt your quilt. So you could do echo quilting like we talked about today. You could stitch in the ditch and do that invisible stitching. You could do some echo quilting within the blocks, or simply stitch around each star pattern to highlight each star pattern. Or for a small quilt like this, the blocks, the elements are small. I like to do some dramatic straight line machine quilting, some diagonal lines and some straight lines. I hope you'll give straight line machine quilting a try with your next quilt. We hope you've enjoyed this Stitch It Sisters video. You'll find the Ultimate Quilt and Stitch presser foot along with a limited number of project bundle boxes at stitchitsisters.com. Be sure to tune in again for another Stitch It Sisters sewing adventure. In the meantime, connect with Stitch It Sisters and friends on our social sites. Stitch It Sisters is made possible by Clover, Pellon, Schmetz Needles, and shopnzp.com.